Well, welcome to the latest in our series of Lexington Remembers television show, which features people talking about their memories of town and their involvement of town. We're absolutely delighted to have as our guest today Col Paul O'Shaughnessy, known to all of us as the Colonel of His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot. We see them every April on the green, beating up on the sturdy Yankee yeomen, the Lexington Militia, in their bloodthirsty fashion. And I think it's pretty nice of us to have the enemy here involved with us. Paul, that's a splendid uniform. You want to tell us something? The militia, we call the Lexington Minutemen, our dress uniform is sort of reminiscent of the Continental Army uniform after Washington took over. I think our colonials that we wear at the battle are much closer to actually what the farmers on the green would have worn. Tell us about yours. Is that pretty accurate representation?
Yes, as best as we're able to determine from paintings, from material samples that date back that far. This is rather close to the uniform of a field grade officer in a regiment, colonel or lieutenant colonel. The uniform is distinctive to the regiment in a few manners. One of them is what is known as the facing color. When you look at paintings of British officers, and frankly any soldiers, European soldiers of the day, and this even included the Continental Army as they became established and got uniforms, is they would have some distinctive color of coat. And then they would have and that was generally across the army and often by function. Dragoons had a color, and infantry had a color, artillery had another. And then the regiments could be identified by what was known as a facing color. This appeared on the facings, what we today might call a lapel, as well as the cuffs and the collar of the uniform. It's again identification. This all seems very ostentatious and elegant, perhaps. Yes. So these colors and the elegance, I think, as you put it very nicely, of these uniforms served a couple of purposes. The colors allowed identification, quick identification. Oh, those are dragoons, and they are from such and such a regiment. You could look through a spyglass and recognize the cuff colors. Also, there were distinctive colors to the regiment. Also, you've seen these large, what we today would call flags, known as colors in the United Kingdom. They have a distinctive color. So in the midst of a melee, you could hear the drum saying "Rally on the colors." You could look at your cuff, look around, look for the yellow flag, and go for it. So it actually had a practical purpose. The other was simply that back in this day, as was true well into the 20th century and perhaps true today, you are judged by the clothes that you wear. And this is a good suit of clothes. And it was a good suit of clothes for an officer, who of course does not have to really worry about his station in life, but particularly for the rank and file, the uniform was probably the best clothing that they'd ever had. And they got a new one at least once a year, a new issue of clothing, and they were able to strut about and say, "Look at me, I'm a soldier, I have a career." And there was the same level of respect to some degree of soldiers, but the Army was something that you took on as a career, and you spent a good chunk of your life into it. So having a good suit of clothes that identified you as a soldier made all the sense in the world.
Now, the rank and file, or what we would call now the enlisted men as opposed to the officers, how does their uniform differ from yours?
Right. So it looks at a glance very similar. However, a few details. First of all, I don't know if it shows up in this light very well, but this is more of a scarlet color than a red. The men's uniforms tended to be more of a bricky red. This was not necessarily by design, it was sort of fashion. The bricky red color comes from the madder root, which is a madder plant, is just almost a weed that grows all over Northern Europe. Very easy to turn into a red dye, was very inexpensive, and it was pretty color fast. But perhaps a century or so earlier, there had been the discovery of the cochineal bug, which comes from South America, and to this day is used to make scarlet and crimson dyes. And it was, of course, exotic, it was imported, it was all the rage, and so it ended up on all of the officers' coats. You mixed these with what was known as a mordant in order to get the right tone, and you got this rather nice coat. One thing about these coats, people always ask us, are they hot? And they're not really as bad as they look, because they're made, first of all, out of wool, and they're lined generally with linen on the inside, as are the shirts made of linen. So the wool is fulled, meaning it's been boiled or been heated up or washed in hot water, then beaten flat or rolled flat, beaten again, washed until it's all actually shrunk up, and the weave and the weft have actually gotten together into more of a felty material. Then you can cut these things. You can cut the fabric raw, and you don't have to hem it. So most 18th century coats are actually made from the inside out with top stitching, but it's so fine, it's so good that you don't really. It's not like 1970s top stitching. It's very, very nice stuff, and so it's usually done along the edges of these lapels and such, but also around every buttonhole. The other thing is the lacing that you see here is there to. These all surround every buttonhole, so these reinforce the buttonholes. So all of these have dual purposes. They serve a purpose, but they're also decorative. I have a silver lace, and other regiments have golden, woven gold lace, rather expensive stuff. The men would tend to have a wool lace, about a half-inch wide wool lace around every buttonhole, as well as decorative elements in other areas. But the lace was always used to cover a seam, cover a buttonhole, something like that.
Now, how do I know that you're a colonel and not a lieutenant?
So they did not have chevrons in particular, say, sleeve apparel about in that regard. However, there were distinctions of rank, and they generally had to do, well, first of all, backing up, you can tell that I am an officer for a couple of reasons. One is I'm wearing what is known as a gorget. This is a remnant of armor, from medieval armor. You have to remember, your knights in shining armor are generally the officers of the army of their day. So as armor goes away in the face of gunpowder and shot, this remains as a sign of rank or a reminder of a piece of armor from that period. The specific piece it represents is a neck piece that went under the helmet but over the breastplate. And in French, this is le gorge, and so something that covers the neck is a gorget. Or, as the English like to mispronounce these things deliberately, sometimes a gorget or gorget. Probably a gorget. The other is a sash that I'm wearing here. This is a silk, red or scarlet silk or maroon almost, or sash that is simply it dates from livery. So the trouble in medieval times is you get buttoned up in these steel uniforms, if you wish, or steel armor assemblies, and nobody can tell who you are. So you would have to use distinctive colors, distinctive patterns, distinctive embroidery, or imprints or embossing on or engraving on the steel. And in fact, on the gorget, we still have some of that here. We have the lion and the unicorn of the British monarchy, which you still see to this day. It's exactly the same. The lion is for England, the unicorn is for Scotland. Okay. A small detail is that the United Kingdom in 1775 is only England and Scotland. It did not include Ireland at the time. So when you look at our flags, there are only 2 crosses in that flag and not the 3rd cross of St. Patrick yet. That doesn't happen until after. So the third thing that I'm carrying, which isn't particularly distinctive to officers, but is a further hint, is this sword, which is, and this is the one thing that I have with me today, which is actually an original. This is an original sword from, not necessarily from the American Revolution, but definitely from the era. And it is definitely a British foot officer's sword. There is an engraving on here, GR, which is George Rex, or George the King in Latin. There is some decorative, some rose engravings for England. And on the other side here we have again the lion and the unicorn of the British monarchy. The sword itself was made by a gentleman named Runkel, and it was made in Solingen, Germany. And so, which is, I believe, still a place where at least knives and razor blades and things of that sort of thing are made today. But this is actually the real deal, probably from the 1780s or something like that. I don't know that it's ever done any damage to anybody, but there are a few nicks and such in it. So somebody hit something with it long ago. We try to take care of these.
Where did you get that from?
This was actually a gift from the gentleman who started our regiment, Vincent Keogh.
Yeah.
And he gave it to me, I think, about 10 years ago. He was getting on a bit, and he decided he wanted to make sure his stuff went to the right places and all. And at the time, I was the commanding officer of the regiment, so he gave it to me as a gift. And
where did he get it?
He got it, I believe, he got it in the United Kingdom. He may have purchased it, I believe, at the time you could actually, this was in the 1970s, late 1960s and early 1970s, I believe you could pick these things up in antique shops.
Really?
You know, and at consignment stores and things of that nature. They were not particularly valued. I'm not sure how much this would be today. I don't think I want to think about it.
Yeah, right. Right.
So, but it probably would be some thousands of dollars, I imagine. Back then you could get them for 200.
Yeah.
So I have a sword of mine that I picked up. I have a second one that I purchased about 20 years ago, and I got that in a blind auction on Cape Cod. You know, I bid over the phone for it, and I won. So.
Is that also an antique? Or
yes, that one is also antique, similar, from a very similar era. It is almost identical to this one, excepting that the engraving has gold worked into it, so it shows up a little bit more. And one of the wings of the bell here that protects your hand actually folds up, so that when you have it in the scabbard against your body, it actually folds and hugs to your body a little more nicely. This doesn't dig in, but it does stand out a little bit. So the other one is actually a little fancier. Mm-hmm. So, but it's really quite something, and they do come apart. You can basically unscrew up here and take the entire blade out and clean it and all of that. So that's what we do.
It's not too hard to buy replicas. I got my son is an officer in the Minutemen, and I got him a sword. There's a company that makes it.
Yes, there are several, and I have a replica also. If it's raining or I'm going to be doing something particularly harsh, I'll leave this thing at home and I'll bring the replica out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, as to being a colonel, I know you're an officer
Mm-hmm.
because of the color and the
Right.
sash.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know you're a colonel and not lieutenant a dare?
Right, so my single epaulette on the right shoulder is actually the particular and a little bit of the pattern of the uniform, although I've mixed mastered a few things here, but the big one is the epaulette on the right shoulder. And actually there was an irony that the fewer epaulettes you carried generally showed you to be of a higher rank. If I was a line officer in, for example, the Grenadier Company, I would have two epaulettes because I actually had two belts. I would have a belt that was for my sword or bayonet, and I would also have one for my cartridge box, which was where my ammunition would be stored. Officers in line in infantry companies very often were armed, and particularly in what were known as flank companies, which were the Grenadiers and the light infantry.
Now, the 10th Regiment was light infantry.
No, actually the 10th Regiment, it had a light infantry company, but it actually was a full regiment, which at the time consisted, at least on paper, of 10 companies. Each company approximately 30 to 35 men, and two of those companies were known as flank companies, and they were special. One was the light infantry, and they were employed in what was referred to at the time as petite guerre, small war, what we today might call irregular fighting or skirmishing. The myth that the British didn't know how to do this sort of thing is simply false. In fact, they were amongst some of the masters of the planet in that regard. So they had a company of light infantry, and it happens to be that it was the company of light infantry that was on the green, and that's why we think of the 10th as light infantry.
Why did it have a Marine lieutenant in command?
Well, that has a great deal to do with sort of the mix of regiments and officers and such that were in Boston at the time. What had happened was, as the situation deteriorated in Boston, Regiment's General Gage, who is now, as of the summer of 1774, becomes not only commanding officer of forces in North America, which he has been for some time, but now also the governor of Massachusetts. He begins pulling regiments in from wherever he can get them in North America, generally, because they're under his command and he can bring them in. So it's a matter of who's available. And he also needed as many as he could get. So he pulled in a regiment of Marines that were on ships at the time. They weren't needed on the ships particularly, but they were desperately needed to keep order in the town and to, when the time came, to try to pull the teeth of this growing rebellion. So the Marines were very often employed on land, but they would generally be assigned to ships. But just in this instance, they weren't, and he came, Major Pitcairn came with them. He was just a senior officer.
Was Pitcairn a Marine?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
Yeah, he is a major in the Marines.
Okay.
And they were not the Royal Marines at the time, they were simply Marines.
Okay.
That was a moniker that was assigned to them later. So General Gage has had dealings with Colonel Smith in the previous several years.
Colonel Smith being the commanding officer of the detail that went out here on April 19th.
Right, he's the lieutenant colonel. I referred to him as colonel. Lieutenant colonels are typically referred to as colonel in the absence of the real colonel, because lieutenant simply means that you're standing in for somebody else, right? So General Gage, as we get into the spring of 1775, General Gage has been given new instructions from London, and this is that he is to that the opinion of the government now is that they have bent over backwards as far as they're going to go to try to accommodate these New Englanders, and enough is enough. And also simply that every time the government appears to back off, it simply encourages and emboldens those who would revolt. And now, of course, they're gathering arms, and rather dramatically so, out in the countryside. Gage is now ordered to put an end to this. He puts together this expedition. He looks to Smith to lead it, because I think he probably is looking for an officer he can trust and has some prudence, because Gage is desperately trying to serve two masters. He's trying to obey the instructions from London to put an end to this, but at the same time he realizes that he's walking on eggs, and that Massachusetts is a powder cake. If he missteps, he's going to have a war on his hands. And he realizes also, he's no dummy, he realizes he's badly outnumbered should that happen. So I think he looks to Smith for some prudence. We don't know necessarily whether Smith picks Pitcairn or whether Pitcairn is chosen for him. Pitcairn is an aggressive officer, he's a capable officer, he's highly respected, but he also he's not one to pussyfoot around. His comments with regards to this growing rebellion are, one should burn a few of their towns or burn a few of their villages and all will be put right. He just feels, his belief is that these New Englanders, these farmers and such, that they have a glass jaw. One good punch and it'll all fold up. He wasn't quite right about that, but anyway, that's a long story. But so anyway, and then there are other officers that sort of join on to the expedition because everybody wants to get out of Boston. If you're in an army and you've been cooped up with these people spitting on you and throwing things out of the window at you, and people getting into fights every night, and it's just miserable, and now you're being given an opportunity to go out into the countryside and show them how it's really done, you join in. And that's exactly what happened here. Most officers found an excuse to go along on this expedition. There were a few malingerers who did not.
Now, I always heard that one of the problems that Colonel Smith had was that it was kind of a mixed bag. I mean, he had companies from different units, and who hadn't served together and who hadn't served under these particular officers before.
Right, there is an element of that. I think it's sometimes exaggerated. It's not like these soldiers had never served, had never seen each other before. They were all a part of this garrison. But this is a garrison army. Many of these soldiers have not seen actual warfare in some time. Some have. But the previous war was the French and Indian that ends in 1763. There was Pontiac's rebellion in the what was the Northwest, the Michigan, what's now Michigan at the time. But other than that, and there have been a few skirmishes with the French here and there, but generally things have been peaceful. So the army at this point is really not that sort of tuned fighting machine that you tend to get after a few years of warfare. It was actually in the nature of the way they did things to brigade together similar companies, that is, all of the light infantry and all of the grenadiers together in order to make a more effective force. I think part of the trouble here was that the light infantry was very much a French and Indian war effort, as well as earlier wars, and were considered to be very effective in the kinds of woodland fighting that you got in that war. But then they had been sort of cast aside until now. It was realized in 1771 and 2 that they were really very effective troops, so they pulled it all back together again. But it's really tough to suddenly create a whole new force, get it all working and get it all trained properly in 1772, 3, 4, and have it ready in 5 to pull off an expedition like that. So the soldiers are not at the peak of their talents, perhaps. But at the same time, they are not. You look at what they accomplished. You look at the distances that they covered, and you look at the severity of the attack upon them. And I describe this to modern soldiers in the American Army: the distances, the numbers, the odds, the relative ratios of men, the weaponry at the time, and they're impressed.
Yeah, the numbers that I've heard, Paul, is that there were 19,000 militia on the road. There were 5,000, 4,700, something like that, actually engaged in Battle Road coming back from Concord, and there were about 700 regulars until they got to Lexington. Then there were about 1,700. So they were way outnumbered.
Yes. Now, fortunately for Smith and then Percy, they didn't have to deal with all of those 4,700 at the same time.
Right.
Most of these companies come in, fire several volleys, maybe harass the column, but the column is moving quickly, and there's a tendency, as soon as they're sort of out of your zone, they sort of pass them on to the next one. And a great deal of this firefighting is done near the rear of the column. At very few points do the militia try to somehow get out in front and stop the column. There are a few places where something like that begins to try to happen, and there are some definitely some severe ambushes, such as what occurs near Bloody Angles, and again, of course, Parker's Revenge. And then Fisk Hill. So that's three rather difficult encounters, all in probably the course of 2 miles, 2 or 3 miles. But they're pretty badly outnumbered, and it's very fortunate that a lot for the column that they got going when they did back out of Concord, or they would have probably faced some fraction of that remaining 10,000.
Because they're all coming in
right.
from all over the place.
Exactly.
Now, Parker's Revenge is a current project, and the National Park, the Friends of the National Park, are trying to figure what the topography there was like and what actually happened. Mm-hmm. That's all underway. And Colonel Smith was knocked off his horse at Parker's Revenge?
I'm not sure if he was knocked off his horse. He was wounded in the foot by a ball. Not one, it didn't seem that it was severe enough to truly disable him, as in like he had to have his foot taken off or something like that. But it certainly put him rather out of commission, and we have accounts of the soldiers finding what was known as a sulky, or a small cart, horse-drawn cart, and he transferred over to that in order to go the rest of the way. And in fact, we have an account from Jeremy Lister that I believe it was Smith who loans him his horse, loans the horse that he can no longer ride, loans it over to Lister, who was an ensign who had come out with the 10th Light Infantry. He gets shot in the right elbow, and so he's probably not looking his best. And I think that Smith takes pity on him and gives him his horse.
His horse.
Right.
So Parker's Revenge was a pretty dramatic piece of Battle Road.
Yes, although I would imagine fairly brief. You know, I think that we sometimes have a tendency to think of these things as drawn-out battles, and we probably don't help that illusion with our reenactment at Tower Park, which I refer to sometimes as the Waterloo version of Battle Road. Yeah. We have to remember that this was a fast-moving event, and that the soldiers cover about something on close to 40 miles in about 12 hours. Yeah. And that's with stops and such. So when you look at and they realize that they're in a race against units that are coming in, militia units. So they're moving along quite well. And we have modern soldiers today that march that route, and they're cranking right along, and they meet all of the mileposts and the time stamps at about the same time that the British column did. So
Now the 10th Regiment had quite a history. When was it founded? And tell us about the 10th Regiment and where it is now.
right. Well, I'll
And
give
then
you.
we'll talk about your 10th Regiment.
Okay, so I'll give you a little of the history of the 10th Regiment, the original. It wasn't the 10th Regiment when it started. It was the Earl of Bath's regiment. It was created in 1685 in response to something called Monmouth's Rebellion. But the rebellion was so short-lived that the regiment really didn't see particularly any action in that. But it was raised in support of the king at the time, ironically a Catholic king. But he, I think, was sufficiently rattled by this effort to depose him that he kept these raised regiments raised and kept them in existence and made them what is called part of the establishment. That was the established army, which eventually becomes the regulars, the regular army. The regiments back then didn't even have red coats. They had quite a variety of uniforms, and they are known by their colonel's name for many years. But this means that they keep changing their name. You know, Fred's regiment becomes Jim's regiment, becomes Ernie's regiment, and it gets very difficult. So finally they say, all right, enough of that. We'll just number them according to seniority, starting with 1 and going on up. And this is of course the army that was established as part of the Restoration after the Commonwealth or Republic had fallen. And the 10th was, when they did the math, the 10th was the 10th Regiment that had been created. So it was given the number 10. And this happened around the middle of the 18th century. And so rolling into the French and Indian War, the 10th actually didn't see much action at all in the French and Indian War. The last time they had really been in some serious battles prior to the American Revolution was in the Williamite Wars, Malplaquet, Oudenarde, a lot of the battles up in Flanders between the French and Dutch allies and Dutch allies of the British and in that whole area. So, which was early 18th century.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
but the guys who were out here on April 19th were
They had not. Most of them had not.
mostly Irish.
Yes, many of them are Irish. We have a number of rosters of. We don't have a lot of rosters of the men in ranks, but we have a number of names of dischargees, deserters, and prisoners of war, for example, and throughout the war. And they are a mix of. They are a mix of what England looked like or the United Kingdom looked like at the time. There was an overabundance to some degree of Irishmen, but not actually a majority in the regiment, because they had a tendency, if you were recruited, you could end up in a couple of different regiments, possibly. A lot of regiments did local recruiting, but they also got sort of central casting soldiers. Remember, England has a lot larger population than any of the other kingdoms at the time in the area. But there was a mix of Irish, English, a few Scots, a few Welsh, but interestingly, a significant number of German names. And I believe those come from Hanover, because the King George, as well as being the King of England, is also the Elector of Hanover. So this is just another territory, and he's recruiting there as well as throughout the British Isles. So, but it is true that they're not raw recruits. These are people, we have an image of them being teenagers, and they're not actually. They're in their late 20s, they're in their early 30s. They've often been apprentices in some other career, and they join the Army because either that wasn't successful, or or maybe they just want to see the world or something. But they join the Army, and they often practice their skill, be it cabinetry or tailoring or what have you, or iron work or something like that. And they'll do that right in the regiment as part of the economy of the regiment.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, armies back then, this is a growing imperial army. They do most of their work is garrisoning spots, making sure that everything is peaceful and that Pax Britannicus rules. And so as they come into Boston, this is, for many of them, the first time that anyone has shot at them in anger. Mm-hmm. It's certainly an experience for them, no doubt.
So then what happens to the 10th Regiment as the years pass? They participate in the Revolution.
Right. They were in Ireland, which is why prior to the war, they were in Ireland, which is why they tended to have a few more Irishmen. They get sent to Canada in 1767. They get sent out to the Great Lakes in 1772. And they get back to Canada thinking, hey, we've done our job, we're going to be going back to Ireland or England. But suddenly, as I had mentioned earlier, General Gage is pulling everybody in from everywhere. They get sent to Boston, and that's how they end up in Boston in 1775. They fight through the early part of the Revolution, but by 1778, through disease, desertion, casualties, and just wear and tear, the companies themselves are down to a shadow of what they used to be. They're probably 10 or 15 men, and they're not effective anymore. So what they do is they draft the regiment. They actually take the rank and file and put them into other regiments. And this is how you get this mixing up bit in the British armies. Regiments were not routinely, but very often were drafted. Their men were split up. The officers, the musicians, and some of the non-commissioned officers would go back to some part of the British Isles and raise a new regiment up in that name in the 10th. So every once in a while you got a completely new regiment and all of the guys. This is how we end up finding artifacts from the 10th Regiment in the ground, from places that we know the 10th Regiment never went. Belt buckles and things of that nature. How did that happen? Well, it was these 10th Regiment guys that got sent into another regiment, the 64th or other ones, and they fought at, say, some southern battlefield where the 10th was never actually sent. So, and then the 10th goes on to do imperial duty all over the world. They never actually fight Napoleon head to head because they fight in Egypt, but Napoleon had already hopped on his boat and gotten out of there because he knew it was a lost cause. But they do, to this day, the regiment, or as long as it existed, had a sphinx as part of its emblem in honor of that. They ended up in India, up in what is now Pakistan. They fought a heroic battle at a place called Sabran, which is in northern Pakistan today. And then they went on to fight in the Boer War, and then certainly in World Wars I and II. By this time they were known as the Lincolnshire Regiment. In fact, they had been given that designation in the late 18th century, North Lincolnshire and then Lincolnshire. They made them territorial. And then as we come out of World War II, they do some work in the Cold War, but now the British Army is actually on the way back down again. And so going into modern times, there is amalgamation after amalgamation after amalgamation, and the Lincolnshires end up as the 2nd Battalion of today's Royal Anglian Regiment. But we still know people in them, and they actually look at us and think we're pretty cool because they look at us as the carrying on that tradition of the 10th Regiment.
Right. And the 10th Regiment of Foot wasn't the only body of regulars that came out here that day.
Oh no, the 10th, in fact, the only companies of the 10th that came out, at least with Colonel Smith, was the Grenadiers and the Light Infantry. The others stayed in Boston. They may have come out with General Percy, later in the day,
Okay.
or at least some companies. But I don't think so. I think they stayed in Boston. So it was really just the light infantry. So there's only about 35 members of the light infantry of the 10th on the green. There are about 100, maybe 110 or so soldiers, the Marines, 4th and the 10th, with the 5th nearby, that are actually on the green, up against what we now know to be approximately 80 of the Lexington Militia.
Yeah,
So actually fairly even odds on the green.
yeah, yeah. Now, your 10th Regiment,
Mhm.
where did that ever come from, and
Well-
why?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was just contacted by the National Park Service, a ranger there, who discovered an interview that they had done with our founding commanding officer, Vincent J.R. Keogh. He's passed on, unfortunately. He was a makeup artist and also freelance photographer. And he was living in Chelmsford and was involved in the militia in that area. And he got an assignment to go out and take pictures of a reenactment at North Bridge. And the militia showed up, and the British were there. But the British were in literally red paper hats and waiters' vests, red waiters' vests, and cut off jeans.
Really?
Yeah. And
When was this?
this would have had to be about probably 1966 or 7.
That recent?
Yeah. And he snapped a few pictures and then just realized that nobody was going to pay him a dime for these things and he should stop wasting his film. But being the sort that he was, he started to cast about and figure out, this is a problem to solve. We can't have British in red paper hats. That just doesn't work. So he started to research this. He had been himself in the 10th Mountain Division during World War II. So he discovered that the 10th Regiment was one of those out at the bridge that day. And he decided to try to recreate the 10th Regiment. He actually got in touch with the Royal Lincolnshire Regimental Association, which was the retired officers and men's organization from the Lincolnshire or 10th Regiment. Told them what he wanted to do, and they went, "Oh, jolly good, wonderful idea." And they opened the doors to a whole bunch of regimental museums and records and things of that nature. And he was able to go in and look at fabrics and artifacts, things of that nature. He studied the subject, and he came up with a uniform, which we now know was probably half wrong, but it was light years ahead of what was going on at the time, and certainly far better than red paper hats. But he kept revising it and revising it. By the early 70s, he had probably 30 or 40 members, and he had been able to create a couple of companies, a light infantry company and a grenadier company. I joined in 1972. I had a job on Lexington Green as a tour guide. That put some money in my pocket, and we were going to join the militia, some friends of mine and I, who were also tour guides. And we were looking around, and then suddenly one day we saw these British soldiers on Lexington Green, and with gleaming muskets and brass buckles and redcoats and all of that, and swords and bayonets. And we're teenage boys, and so we just went, cool. And they didn't really want us to join. They were like, "Get away, kid! Go away." But finally, we were persistent. They talked to our parents. They discovered we were actually serious.
How old were you, Paul?
I would have been 15 at the time.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. We were persistent, and then finally they said, "All right, if your parents say it's okay, you can do it." And so they put us in there. I ended up in the light infantry as a private, and I've been a member of the regiment ever since. So.
Now, what about Lexington reenactments? There weren't any before the mid-60s?
There had been, but they had been
I
associated.
thought so.
Yeah, they had been associated. I think they were episodic. They had them on the for example, 1925.
Yeah.
I think there was a reenactment on the green, and I think there might have been one at the centenary in the 1875. There hadn't been, to my knowledge, anything like that since the 1925, because I think I don't believe there was anything in, say, 1950. There probably were ceremonies, but I'm not sure there was a reenactment. So the reenactments were they were brought back, I should say, by the Lexington Minutemen and Vincent Keogh in, I believe, something like 1971.
Yeah, I
That
think
sounds
so.
about right.
Yeah.
And they developed a script, they developed roles, they worked it out, and it was very much like what you see today, although we've spiced it up here and there. And I actually got my first opportunity to do that in 1973. I joined in, say, August, September of 72. So I got my first chance to do that in 73, 74, and then, of course, the bicentennial event of 1975.
Well, there were about as many, it must have been 500 regulars, that 400 or 500 regulars.
Well, yeah, we brought in a whole bunch of people for that, for the
from
bicentennial.
Canada, from Britain.
Right, and I remember that, and I also remember very, very distinctly that I think due to daylight savings, the way it worked and such, it was actually darker when we used to do it back then.
Yeah.
I may have this backwards, but it seems lighter now when we do it, and also very often we do it later in April. But
that's true.
you sometimes do the calendar, but I remember in 75, the entire green was covered. It was fairly dark, and just sun was just peeking up a little bit, and the entire green was covered in about 6 inches or so of mist, of fog, and you really couldn't see the crowd. So all you saw were these sort of ethereal Minutemen at the other end, and it was like getting in a time machine. It was absolutely.
I was out there that day too.
Yeah, you were on the other side, right?
That's right.
Right.
That's
So,
right. Well, you know, the culture now. See if my impression is right.
Mhm.
The culture of the militia, of the Lexington Minutemen, and the culture of the 10th Regiment is, I think, quite different. I remember when I was president of the Historical Society, and I did that morning script, you know, describing the thing to the crowd, and I think George Gabriel, who was Captain Parker, said to me, okay, well now, you know, put the good stuff up front, because the regulars may show up and you just lose the bottom of the story. And I said, well, look, come on. I mean, they're just in Depot Square, and there are walkie-talkies, and all they have to do is just call and say, is it okay for us to come now? And they looked at me as if I were from another planet. They said, oh, they never do that.
Right.
They're going to come when they want to come.
Right. You're correct. There's always been, and I think I can claim that under my leadership, such as it is, of the regiment, or such as it was, that we've eased off on that a little bit. But the whole mentality of the regiment, and I think the 10th was distinctive in this regard, was very somewhat militaristic, very aggressive, and I think a lot of this was brought about by the fact that at the time there were a lot of units, British as well as American units, that were quite lackadaisical. I wouldn't put the Lexington Militia or Minutemen there, but there were others that, you know, they kind of came out in sneakers and sunglasses and things like that. And I think that Vincent Keogh felt that he was really battling against that entire attitude. And so there was sort of a combative stance taken, and it's we'll be here at this time, take it or leave it. That's the way it is. That's the way we do things. Never, and I think that this rankled a number of people, and some people genuinely didn't like us at all. Never mind that we were playing the British. They just genuinely thought that we were a bit rude, and so I think later on I took over the regiment in the late 1990s. So that's now what 20 years later. I think by that time that act had gotten old, mm-hmm. And so I felt that we really needed to streamline a little bit and work cooperatively with our apparent adversaries who aren't adversaries at all.
Yeah, right.
And I think that was greatly welcome. But you're spot on in terms of how things were being run back then.
But your meetings, at least I've always heard, you're pretty demanding on
Yes.
on the other ranks.
Yes, we are.
They better be there at the right time, and they better have their brass polished and all.
That's right. That's and I have to admit that the society has changed a little bit. It's tougher and tougher to really enforce that in as strictly as we once did. But I think that's a good thing. I think that it's like these regiments, when they're really good, they're like a combination of a sports team and a theatrical troupe. And if people join a soccer team or a football team, and they're expected to be at the practice on time. And if they're not, coach won't play you. And nobody gives them any nonsense about that at all. And if you are in a theatrical troupe, it's expected that you will be at the rehearsals and you will be on time, ready to go, and you'll know your lines. And this is the same thing. And yet, it's funny, I mean, we really do continue to try to enforce this. But we get people who join and we explain this to them, and rarely, but they don't get it. It's sort of it's an interesting thing. They're like, well, you're being mean to me. No, I'm not being mean to you.
This is the way we do it.
This is the way we do it. If you're going to do this, nobody put a gun to your head and said you had to be a British soldier. But if you're going to be a British soldier, you're going to do it. You're going to be as if you were in ranks. You're going to play a part, and that's why we do enforce these things. And we've had people get all huffy and storm out and get upset with us and such. But they're really, the alternative would be that you come out onto an event like Lexington Green with sloppy soldiers that don't know their drill.
Yeah, right.
And that would be like going to see Shakespeare and have them go to be or whatever.
This thing go.
Yeah, right, exactly.
How many people do you have?
Right now, we have about 35 effectives in the 10th Regiment. 35 effectives and probably 40, just over 40 on the books.
But it's a lot more than that turn up at the Green.
Oh, that's right. We do invite now. Back in the 1970s, to some degree, the 10th was the only game in town. If you wanted to be in a British regiment, what has happened in the intervening 30 years or so, 30 to 40 years, is other regiments have grown up, and there are now a few choices that people have. So we actually have created something called the Boston Garrison. And it's several different regiments, and we put them all together. So we bring them out. Yeah.
Okay. And are you still recruiting?
Yes, all the time. We are constantly recruiting. We are always looking for people to join in this rather magnificent hobby of ours.
Yeah.
I mean, who else? You can sit and watch TV, or you can do something like this.
Yeah, right.
It's a wonderful icebreaker, and it just, I tell people, join us, and I'll guarantee you the best seat in the house on Lexington Green.
Right. And you meet once a month?
Yes, Lexington Armory.
You do?
Yeah.
Is that where you meet?
Yeah,
the Armory?
Right. We may not be able to stay there. They just checked the rent, but We've been doing it at the Lexington Armory, third Wednesday of every month.
And is there some British Officers Club or something in
Yes.
town that you?
Yes, I'm also a member of, well, I'm a member of a number of things. I'm on the Friends of Minuteman National Park, by the way, the board there. Thank you for mentioning that. There's also a British Officers Club in Boston of actual retired British officers. And I was invited in because of the work I do. I'm not a British officer, I just play one on TV. But they thought highly enough of the work that we do that they invited us in.
Okay, so all the officers of the 10th are part of the British Officers Club, or just you?
Just me, well, actually two of us are at the moment. Others probably will join. And we also have our own officers' mess. The 10th Regiment has its own officers' mess. In fact, I was just at a dinner Wednesday night, and we hang out at, I think it's the Winchester Country Club or something like that. And we dress up and drink a lot.
And you do parades in schools and stuff the way the Minutemen do.
Right. We were just up at the Job Lane School in Bedford, and the kids love it. And we do schools in Lexington, Medford, all over the place, and the parades also. Yeah. The parades are how we raise our money.
Right.
Because we have to pay for insurance.
Us too.
And you can imagine what insurance is like for something like this. You do what with what?
Hey, listen, thank you. This is just splendid.
Oh, great. My pleasure.
This is, I read a great book by a guy named Piers Maxey years and years ago about the revolution from the British point of view and from Whitehall's point of view. It's a great book. And this is much better than the book.
Oh, yes, it does. And you get to play the part.
Yeah.
It also really gets it across to people. You can read a book, which is great, but then you get to talk to somebody. And as we like to say, people call us the enemy, but really you have to remember that we're from the government. We're here to help.
Yeah. Thanks, that was so
All right,
much.
a real pleasure.
Good.
Thanks so much. All right, thank you.